A flight attendant insults Ibrahim Traoré in first class, not knowing he is the president of Burkina Faso. What starts as a moment of prejudice turns into a powerful story of dignity, silence, and strength that changed the world forever. Well, what did you think of this story? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you love real, powerful stories like this, make sure to subscribe. We bring you amazing tales every single day. Long journeys begin quietly. At Ouagadougou International Airport, the glass windows shimmered with the golden light of late afternoon. Inside the first-class lounge, the air was filled with the low hum of air conditioning, clinking glasses, and fingers tapping on smartphones. Passengers reclined in their cushioned seats, men in tailored suits, women in silk scarves, and attendants gliding across the marble floor offering champagne and imported fruit. Among them sat a man who didn't quite belong, or so it seemed. He wore a simple black kaftan. It was clean and pressed, but had no designer logo, no golden buttons, no dramatic collar. His shoes were polished but modest, no rings, no smartwatch, no entourage. His luggage, a small leather bag tucked under the seat, scuffed at the corners. His face, calm, unreadable. He wasn't scrolling through emails. He wasn't talking on Bluetooth. He simply sat there, back straight, eyes quietly scanning the room like he was memorizing it. One of the hostesses noticed him. She smiled at the man next to him, a white businessman in a navy three-piece suit, and offered him a second glass of wine. But when her eyes passed over the quiet man in the black kaftan, she did not smile. She didn't even nod, just moved. On the young couple whispered from across the lounge, "Who do you think he is?" "No idea. Doesn't look like he belongs here, though. Maybe he's someone's assistant." The man said nothing. He had heard this kind of whisper before. In fact, he had heard worse. But today wasn't about defending his place. Today was about watching, listening, feeling. He took a slow sip from a plain glass of water. No lemon slice, no ice. The digital display above flickered. Flight 227, first class boarding now. Gate 4. A ripple moved through the lounge. People stood, grabbing their leather cases and designer bags. The man stood too. He moved quietly, joining the line. He held a first-class ticket in his hand, seat 2A. Ahead of him, a man in a Burberry trench coat had his ticket scanned. The gate attendant, Clara, a slim woman with neatly tied blonde hair and red lipstick, flashed her brightest airline smile. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Jensen. You'll be very comfortable in 2B. Jensen nodded and walked through. Clara's smile stayed intact until the man in black stepped forward. She blinked. Her eyes moved from his face to his clothes, then to his ticket. She frowned. "Sir," she said, holding out her arm, "this line is for first-class passengers only." He calmly held out the boarding pass. Clara hesitated, then took it. She read the seat number. Her jaw tightened. "D," she muttered, half to herself. "Is this a joke?" She looked him up and down again, this time slower, as if trying to decode a puzzle. Then her voice grew louder. "Sir, you must be lost. This flight is not for people like you." A pause. Her words didn't echo, but they landed like thunder. The couple from the lounge looked up. A businessman in line raised an eyebrow. A young woman clutched her phone and started recording quietly. "I beg your pardon," the man asked gently, his voice low but clear. Clara tilted her head. "This is a premium class line, first class. Either someone booked this by accident using your name, or there's been some confusion. Maybe economy is through the next gate." She was smiling, but it was the kind of smile you wear when you're mocking someone. "Ma'am," he replied, "this is my flight, this is my seat." Clara chuckled. "Oh, please, can you even pronounce the name of this airline?" People in line shifted uncomfortably. The man didn't react. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply stood still, calm, grounded, immovable. A younger flight attendant, a junior staffer wearing glasses, walked over. "Everything okay here?" he asked. Clara leaned close to him and whispered loudly enough for those nearby to hear. "This gentleman thinks he belongs in seat 2A. The junior attendant blinked. "Let me scan it." He took the boarding pass, waved it under the scanner. Beep. Green check mark. "It's valid," he said. "Confirmed. Seat 2A." Clara's face changed. She forced a smile, thin as paper. "Must be a system glitch," she muttered. Then louder, "You're seriously going to let this happen?" The junior looked confused. "Why wouldn't I?" Clara stared at the man again, her voice tightening like a trap. "You don't belong there. You know it. I know it. Let's not make this into something it doesn't need to be." The man stepped forward. "I'm not here for drama. I'm just here to sit in my seat." Clara's smile fell away completely. She stepped aside, but not without whispering, "Don't say I didn't warn you." The cabin lights glowed soft gold as the man in the black caftan stepped inside the first-class section. The cool scent of leather, perfume, and polished wood hung in the air. Passengers were settling in, jackets being folded, shoes slipping off. Whispered conversations floated above the gentle hum of the engines. He walked slowly, calmly, every step measured. A few heads turned as he passed. Some looked away. Others stared, just long enough to ask themselves quietly, "How did he get here?" Seat 2A, window seat. He reached up, placed his small leather bag gently in the overhead bin, then sat down, smoothed his caftan, and exhaled softly. Not a sigh, just a release of breath, like a man who had held it for too long. He took a small, worn notebook from his coat and opened it. The pages were filled with careful handwriting in French, some underlined, others smudged from old rain. He began to write. Behind him, Clara stepped into the cabin with a tray of welcome drinks. She smiled and offered champagne to the white man in 2B beside him. Then to the elegant woman in 3A. When she reached 2A, her smile vanished. She looked at the man writing in his notebook, her lips twitching with restraint. "What would you like to drink?" she asked flatly. He looked up. "Just water, please." She tilted her head. "Still or sparkling?" "Still." Without a word, she walked off and returned with a bottle. No napkin, no smile, no tray. She placed it on his table with a faint clunk, enough to make the bottle wobble. He picked it up, twisted the cap silently, and took a sip. A couple across the aisle exchanged glances. The woman whispered to her husband, "Why did she treat him like that?" Her husband replied under his breath, "Maybe she thinks he snuck in." 3 seats behind, a teenage girl watched carefully, her phone resting silently in her lap, camera pointed forward, but recording everything. Clara moved back down the aisle, resuming her practiced charm for the other guests. But there was tension now, like the smell of rain just before a storm breaks. The man in seat 2A turned his head slightly and looked out the window. The tarmac outside bustled with carts, flashing lights, and tired workers loading luggage. He didn't frown. He didn't move. But something in his eyes had shifted, the same way the sea darkens before a wave begins to rise. Minutes passed. Boarding completed. The cabin crew went through the motions. The safety video played. Passengers fastened their seatbelts. A baby cried in economy. Someone laughed 2 rows behind. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard Flight 227 to Ouagadougou. Estimated flight time is 6 hours and 22 minutes. Weather en route is mostly clear, with some light turbulence expected midway. We thank you for choosing our airline." Seatbelts clicked, engines roared to life. As the plane rolled forward, the man in 2A closed his notebook and placed it gently inside his coat. He adjusted his seatbelt, His hands rested on his lap. He looked like a man prepared not just for a journey, but for a test. As the aircraft lifted off the runway, the man in 2A leaned his head slightly toward the window, watching the ground grow smaller beneath him. The capital city slowly turned into a patchwork of lights and dark earth, then faded beneath the clouds. Inside the cabin, service resumed. Clara returned, this time with hot towels. She moved down the aisle gracefully, like a dancer rehearsing, moves she'd performed 100 times, but when she reached 2A, she stopped. The man didn't even turn to look. He knew she was standing there, everyone did. She handed a towel to the man in 2B. "For you, sir," she said sweetly, then skipped. 2A moved on without a word. Across the aisle, the older woman in 3B frowned. "Excuse me," she said. "You missed someone." Clara turned. "No, I didn't." The woman blinked. "He's sitting right there." Clara's smile was polite but sharp. "Some passengers prefer not to be disturbed." The woman opened her mouth, then closed it. The man in 2A said nothing. He sat still, his eyes quietly watching the clouds beyond the glass. Lunch service followed. Plates of lamb medallions, grilled asparagus and saffron risotto were presented with flourish. The wine flowed, cutlery clinked. Clara came again, balancing a silver tray with practiced elegance. At 2A, she placed the tray down harder than necessary. "Hope this meets your standards," she said. He looked at the food, then back at her. "Thank you." His voice was calm, as always. But Clara's face twisted slightly, as if the very sound of his politeness offended her. She walked away. François Delicourt, seated across the aisle in 2C, watched silently. A seasoned French CEO in his 60s, François had spent decades in boardrooms across Europe and Africa. He had seen power worn like armor and weakness hidden behind smiles, and he could tell. This man wasn't weak. He leaned back, crossing his legs, observing Clara from a distance. A few seats back, the junior attendant adjusted his collar nervously. He'd seen it all, the comments, the stares, the subtle and not so subtle dismissals. And now he was watching passengers begin to whisper. "Did you see what she just did? She's ignoring him completely. Does she know she's being recorded?" Phones were out again, not openly, but subtly. A woman pretended to check her email, while her front camera quietly filmed. The man in 2A reached for his fork. He hadn't touched his food yet. He paused, glanced sideways, and then calmly began to eat, as if nothing unusual had happened. As if he had endured far worse in silence, and he had. Suddenly the cabin jolted, a slight bump, turbulence. Seatbelt lights blinked on. A few passengers tightened their belts. Clara re-emerged. "Please keep your seatbelts fastened. We are entering mild turbulence," she announced. As she checked seatbelts, she paused again near 2A. "You might want to hold on tight," she said, with a dry smirk. "Wouldn't want you flying out of first class." He looked at her, unblinking. "Thank you for the reminder." She stiffened, unprepared for the grace in his tone. The bumpiness passed, but the discomfort remained. Not in the aircraft, in the air between people. Later, she returned to collect trays. When she reached him, she picked up the dish like it was infected. "No feedback," she said sarcastically. He looked up. "It was warm." Clara scoffed and turned. François had seen enough. As she passed him, he leaned slightly into the aisle and said, "Excuse me, Clara, may I ask something?" She stopped. "Yes, Mr. Delicourt. Why are you treating that man like an intruder?" Her smile faltered. "Sir, I assure you..." He cut her off. "Don't assure me, just observe your own tone. This isn't how you've treated anyone else." She stood straight. "He's been difficult." François raised a brow. "He hasn't spoken more than 10 words." She opened her mouth to argue, but other passengers were now watching. One even clapped softly from behind. Clara turned and walked briskly to the galley. Inside, she paced like a caged lion. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. "He doesn't belong here, and they're all pretending not to see it." She poured herself a glass of water, her hand trembling slightly. Back at 2A, the man closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, not to escape, to center himself. He was used to storms, in the battlefield, in politics, in meetings where everyone wore masks. But this storm, this was personal, not because of her words, because of how many people stayed silent. The wheels touched the runway with a soft double thud. Passengers sat up straighter, the lights in the cabin turned on with a warm click. A robotic voice echoed through the overhead speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Ouagadougou. Please, remain seated until the aircraft comes to a complete stop." Seatbelts clicked. Bags were tugged from overhead bins. People stretched their arms, fixing jackets and checking their phones. Some yawned, others whispered about their meetings, their plans, their connections. But in first class, no one moved, because all eyes were still on seat 2A. The man in the black kaftan remained seated, calm, still, waiting. The quiet strength he had carried the entire flight now felt like a storm about to break. Clara walked in from the galley, her clipboard in hand, checking passenger logs. She saw him again, still there, composed, untouched by her entire display of humiliation. It burned her. She approached slowly, almost hissing under her breath. "I hope you enjoyed the illusion of luxury, sir," she said, just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. He turned his head toward her, expression blank. "Next time," she said, "try booking a seat you actually belong in." He said nothing, so she leaned in closer. "You smell like someone who hasn't showered in weeks," she whispered, venom dripping. "You think this cabin respects you? It tolerates you, that's all." The woman in 2B gasped. She had heard. "Enough! That's enough!" she snapped. "Your behavior is disgusting." Clara turned to her, shocked. "Excuse me?" "No," the woman said louder. "You don't get to excuse yourself. You insulted this man the entire flight, and for what? Because he didn't look rich enough for you?" Clara straightened. "I was doing my job." "Humiliating a man for breathing isn't your job," said another voice. It was François Delicourt. He stood slowly, buttoning his suit. "You've embarrassed yourself, this airline, and every decent person here." Clara opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her skin turned pale, her hands trembled. She turned, only to find nearly half the cabin passengers standing behind her, some with phones still recording, some with eyes wet. François looked at the man in 2A, and for the first time his voice softened. "You, sir, have shown more class in silence than any of us have in all our words." Suddenly the cabin door opened. A gust of warm air entered. Outside, the sun was shining bright. But what stunned the passengers was what lay just beyond the exit stairs. A long red carpet had been rolled out. At the bottom, a black diplomatic vehicle waited, its flag waving gently in the wind, and flanking it, 5 soldiers in full military uniform standing at attention. The passengers pressed to the windows. "Is that for a minister? A president? Who's on board?" Clara blinked. "We didn't get any VIP alerts." Then came the moment. The junior flight attendant, pale and sweating, rushed up the aisle with his phone in his hand. He stopped in front of Clara, showing her the screen. Her face collapsed. On the screen was a photo of the same man she had insulted, wearing a military uniform, standing on a grand stage, saluting thousands. Caption: President Ibrahim Traoré. Burkina Faso. Her voice caught. No, that's not... It can't." The man in 2A stood slowly. He lifted his bag, small, simple, scuffed, and turned toward the door. Clara took a step forward. "Sir," she said, her voice breaking, I didn't know. I didn't mean..." He paused, turned to face her one last time. "Would it have made a difference?" he asked gently. "If you had." Clara's mouth fell open. She said nothing. "Respect," he said, "isn't a gift you save for powerful people. It's the duty you owe every human being." And with that, he walked out. The passengers didn't cheer. They didn't applaud. They stood frozen, some with tears, others with shame. Francois followed behind him, so did the woman from 2B, and as the man stepped onto the red carpet, the soldiers snapped into a full salute. The black car door opened, but the president didn't enter immediately. He turned back and looked at the plane, at the passengers still watching from the window, at Clara, still trembling just inside the door. He nodded, not in anger, not in triumph, in message. He got into the car and closed the door. The soldiers stepped into position. The convoy drove away. Inside, Clara dropped into the jump seat. Her hands shook, her heart pounded, and for the first time in years, she felt small. The junior attendant sat beside her quietly. "You didn't just insult a president," he said. "You insulted everyone who's ever been treated the same," and couldn't say a word back. The video hit the internet before most passengers had even picked up their luggage. Recorded on phones quietly from seatbacks and armrests, it captured everything. The dismissive tone, the cruel comments, the quiet man in 2A sitting silently through it all. And then the final scene, the black car, the red carpet, and the salute. Within minutes, hashtags flooded timelines. President on board, seat 2A, dignity in silence. By the time President Ibrahim Traoré's car reached the gates of the presidential compound, millions had already seen the footage. What was supposed to be an anonymous flight had become a global moment. News anchors scrambled to verify. Was it really him? Was this truly the president of Burkina Faso? And more importantly, had he really been humiliated in broad daylight by a flight attendant in front of dozens of silent passengers? The answer was yes, and the world didn't wait to react. CNN ran it as breaking news. African news networks ran back-to-back segments. Al Jazeera called it a moment that exposed more than prejudice. It exposed the world's silence. Celebrities tweeted. Activists wrote essays. Airlines released statements saying they were reviewing internal procedures. But the world already knew what had happened. Inside the airport, Clara sat alone in a small employee office. Her uniform was wrinkled now. Her hands were cold. Her phone buzzed every few seconds. Messages, missed calls, tags. She didn't dare check them. The airline supervisor entered and placed a thick report on the table in front of her. Printouts of complaints, screenshots of her words, and video stills. Her voice in bold letters. "You smell like you haven't bathed in weeks." She flinched reading it. "Do you realize what you've done?" he said. She opened her mouth. "I didn't know he was..." That's the problem. You didn't know, so you felt entitled to mock, to judge, to strip someone of dignity. And now it's not just on you, it's on us. She looked down. "I was just trying to do my job." "No," he said. "You were abusing your role. You weren't screening tickets, you were screening people. You thought you could smell worth." He held out his hand. "Your badge, Clara." She hesitated, then unclipped the ID from her chest and handed it over. He took it without a word and walked out. Across the city, the president sat in a dark study. The only light came from the desk lamp. On the laptop screen were open tabs, dozens of them, messages from across the globe. Emails from school children, letters from strangers, footage, hashtags, opinion pieces. He read none of them completely. He just skimmed, scanned the chaos the world had created from one act of hate. He sat quietly, his fingers laced together. Soft knock at the door. His assistant entered. "Sir, media have gathered at the palace gates. They're calling it the Seat 2A incident. Would you like to release a statement?" He didn't look up. "Call for a press conference, not to condemn, to teach." That night, under the warm lights of the courtyard, cameras flashed as Ibrahim Traoré stepped forward. He wore the same black jacket. No medals, no flag-draped backdrop. Just a man standing on plain white stone with a microphone in front of Him. I boarded flight 227 as a passenger, not as a president, not as a leader. I wore no rank, no title. And yet what I received was not poor service. It was proof. He paused. Proof that in many hearts, power still wears a face. That respect is still measured by skin, by accent, by suit. No anger in his voice, just clarity and weight. I do not stand here to seek revenge. I stand here because someone, somewhere, who looks like me, is being told right now that they don't belong. He looked into the cameras. And I forgive her. A gasp moved through the press. Yes, he repeated, I forgive her. Not because what she said was right, but because shame has already found her. The world has spoken. The lesson has been delivered. At home, Clara watched the speech on her couch. Her phone muted, her eyes red. The words hit her like stones. Would it have made a difference? If you had known. She broke, fully, completely. Not for being caught, but for being seen for who she had become. She spent the rest of that night writing a letter, a real letter, by hand. No PR firm, no edits, just ink, truth, and regret. Dear President Traoré, I am sorry. Not because you are a president, but because you are a human being. And I forgot that. I was cruel, and you were kind. I humiliated you, and you responded with dignity. You didn't need to forgive me, but you did. I will never forget that. I don't ask you to believe me. I only hope that one day I become someone you would believe. She folded the paper, sealed it in an envelope, and mailed it, not knowing if he would ever read it. Not knowing if he would ever care, but needing deeply to say it anyway. Across the ocean, in the president's office, days later, that letter arrived. He read it in silence. The paper was shaky, the handwriting messy, but the regret was clear. He placed it gently into a drawer filled with others. Letters from people who had judged, people who had apologized, people who had learned. He looked out the window at the quiet sunset, then whispered to himself, "One changed heart is worth more than 1,000 hashtags," and he closed the drawer without a word. It had been 4 days since the flight. Clara hadn't stepped outside. The curtains in her apartment remained closed. The sound of her phone buzzing had faded into the background. She no longer looked. There were thousands of messages, some filled with hatred, some with support, most filled with disappointment. She scrolled once, just once, and saw an old photo of herself, the airline's employee of the month from last year, now pasted next to headlines that read, "Racism in the skies." She turned the phone face down and stared at the ceiling for a long time. On the 5th morning she got up, not for work. She was suspended, pending investigation, not for media. She had refused all interviews. She got up for something she couldn't name. Clara walked to a local shelter for immigrants and refugees, tucked in a quiet street, far from the city's shine. No cameras, no one knew her name there. She didn't ask for attention. She just stood at the reception and said, "Can I help?" The woman at the desk looked up. "Do you have experience?" "No," she admitted, "but I can serve food, fold blankets, clean." The woman stared at her for a moment, then handed her gloves. She began to work. That first day, she didn't speak much. She listened. The second day, she served tea to a woman who had fled war. The third day, she sat beside a child who wouldn't speak, hugging a torn teddy bear. And on the 4th day, that child changed everything. The girl was maybe 6 years old. Her skin was deep brown, her hair in short twists, and her shoes 2 sizes too big. She sat alone, looking down. Clara brought her a blanket. "What's your name?" she asked softly. The girl looked up with wide, glassy eyes. "Aminata." "That's a beautiful name," Clara smiled. "They call me Dirty at school," the girl whispered. Clara's heart stopped. The words echoed in her skull. "You smell like you haven't bathed." That's what she had said, to a man who had done Nothing wrong, and now here was a child, hearing the same thing, feeling the same hurt. She kneeled slowly. "Aminata, they're wrong," she said. "You're not dirty, you're strong and beautiful, and I'm sorry anyone ever made you feel otherwise." The girl blinked, then reached out and touched Clara's hand. Something inside her cracked. Not just guilt, but the first seed of real change. That night, Clara wrote another letter, no longer an apology, a promise. "Dear Mr. President, I don't know if you remember me now, but I remember everything, every word, every second. Not because the world recorded it, but because I carry it inside. I want to tell you, I'm changing. Every day I go to a shelter and meet people who remind me of you. Calm, quiet, but full of worth. I don't ask for redemption, just the strength to keep becoming better. And for what it's worth, thank you. You could have destroyed me. You chose to teach me." Across the ocean, President Traoré stood before a group of advisors in the National Assembly. He held a document titled The Dignity Project. The plan was simple: mandatory racial sensitivity training for all airline and public transport staff, curriculum changes in schools, public service campaigns focused on respect, humanity, and dignity, regardless of who someone appeared to be. He placed the paper down and spoke quietly. "This isn't about one seat on one flight," he said. "It's about every place where someone is told they don't belong. We can't change the world in a day, but we can start with ourselves." An advisor leaned in. "Do you want to name the incident in the campaign, sir?" "No," he said. "Let the world remember the lesson, not the shame." Later that evening, in a school auditorium in Dakar, a teacher projected a sentence on the board. Children read it aloud. "Respect is not a gift, it is a duty." In France, Clara walked past a bakery window and saw a flyer taped to the glass. It read, "Free workshop recognizing unseen prejudice, sponsored by the Dignity Project." She stepped inside, picked up a pen, and signed her name. For the first time in weeks, she stood straight. And somewhere, in a drawer inside the president's office, 2 handwritten letters sat. Not in a folder, not for public record, just kept, because some moments don't need press releases. They just need to be remembered. The stage was quiet. Hundreds of students filled the grand auditorium of the University of Ghana, all eyes fixed on the simple wooden podium placed at the center. No banners, no flags, no anthem, just an empty microphone waiting. Then the doors opened. President Ibrahim Traoré walked in slowly, wearing the same black jacket he had worn on Flight 227. No medals, no guards, only a folder in one hand and calm in his step. He stopped at the podium and looked up at the sea of young faces before him. Some wore school uniforms, others traditional cloth, some just jeans and t-shirts, but all of them silent, waiting. "My story," he began, "is not special." Whispers of surprise moved through the crowd. He raised a hand gently. "Millions of people are disrespected every day, judged by skin, by accent, by how they walk, or where they sit. The only difference is, this time, the world was watching." Hush fell deeper over the room. "They thought I didn't belong," he continued, "because I didn't dress like power. I didn't speak like it, but I did not raise my voice. I didn't need to, because sometimes dignity is loud enough." Students leaned forward. Phones stayed in pockets. Not one pair of eyes left him. "I stayed silent," he said, "not because I couldn't speak, but because I wanted to listen. I wanted the world to hear itself, and when it did, it didn't like what it saw." He paused, opened the folder, and pulled out a crumpled handwritten letter. The one Clara had sent weeks earlier. "She asked me not to reply," he said, "but I did." Another pause. "I didn't write her back. I answered her with a national campaign to make sure no child hears what she said, to make sure no voice is silenced like mine almost was." The letter remained in his hand, trembling slightly in the light. Then he closed it and placed it down. "There is a quote now painted on walls across your country and mine. It is not mine. It belongs to you, to all of us. He stepped back slightly and turned toward the massive projector screen behind him. A single line appeared. If your power makes others feel small, it is not power, it is weakness. For a moment, no one moved. Then the entire hall stood, not with applause, but in stillness, a silence louder than any ovation. Later that evening, the quote appeared on T-shirts in Paris, on classroom walls in Johannesburg, on digital billboards in Lagos. It was printed on bookmarks, on train station pillars, painted in graffiti, tattooed on arms. But far from the spotlight, inside a shelter where children once sat ignored, a little girl named Aminata drew with crayons. In the corner, she held up her picture, a woman with blonde hair and a little girl beside her. Both smiling, she ran to Clara, now dressed in a faded grey T-shirt, mopping the floor nearby. "Miss Clara," she said, "I made us." Clara knelt down, her throat tight. She took the picture in her hand, stared at it. "It's beautiful," she whispered. The little girl leaned in close and said, "You don't look angry anymore." Clara smiled with wet eyes. "I'm not." Elsewhere in the president's office, Ibrahim Traoré stood at the window as sun set over the capital. He looked down at the street below, where a crowd of young people painted the quote across a school's outer wall in chalk. He didn't say anything, just nodded. Once a gentle gesture to the wind, to time, to the past, and the future. That night, the world didn't remember a fight. It remembered the quiet. It remembered a man in seat 2A who didn't raise his voice, yet changed the conversation in every country where silence used to be normal, and long after the hashtags faded, his stillness remained.